Good morning. The 9,013th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Maintenance of International Peace and Security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. Give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, in connection with the adoption of the agenda of today's meeting, which sounds like maintaining peace and security in Ukraine, we'd like to make the following statement. As we have informed you in our working context, we're not against adding to the agenda of the Security Council this item. We see that its authors include all kinds of topics in it, including women, children, education. We conclude that it covers all kinds of aspects of the situation in Ukraine, and in essence, it is universal in character. In this connection, we think it's a good idea to delete from the agenda of the Security Council two other items that pertain to Ukraine. That is the letters from Russia and Ukraine dating from 2014. This reflects common sense and also reflects the current situation. Bearing in mind everything I said, we call on the current presidency of the Council to take the necessary procedural steps in order to formalize adding the new item of the agenda and deleting the two older ones. And we expect that this should be done well in advance so that future presidents of the Council will not have problems in agreeing on the program of work of the Council in upcoming months. Thank you.
I thank the Russian Federation for their statement. Would any other council member like to speak on this point? Yes. I give the... I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you very much. So, colleagues, as we have made clear to council members, including to the Russian Federation, the meeting under today's agenda item was proposed without prejudice to the agenda items regarding the 2014 letter, specifically the 2014 letter from the Ukrainian permanent representative and the 2014 letter from the Russian permanent representative. While the scope of the situation in Ukraine has grown far beyond the circumstances in 2014, it is important to recognize its history. And it is possible that member states will wish to focus on Crimea during future meetings. Accordingly, the earlier agenda items must remain in place. Against this backdrop, I ask that we continue with the meeting and that the agenda be adopted.
I thank the representative of the United States, the representative of the Russian Federation.
I think perhaps we weren't understood correctly. We're not against having meetings continue on the items you mentioned, maintaining international peace and security in Ukraine. So the agenda has been approved already. We can continue. Our comments were simply, we expressed our comments and we hope that they'll be taken into account.
Are there any further comments on this item? The United States? No. Colleagues, it is my understanding that both the Ukraine and Russia letters from 2014 are on the list of items of which the Council is currently seized. I understand that the process for removing items is normally governed by Note 507 and usually takes 3 years. But if there are no other views on this matter, given the split views that we have heard, I propose that we discuss this issue separately and seek to agree a way forward in the coming days. Thank you. So, in accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Sima Bauhaus, the Executive Director of UN Women, Mr. Manuel Fontaine, the Director of Emergencies at UNICEF, and Ms. Katerina Cherepaka, President of La Strada, Ukraine. It is so decided. Ms. Cherepaka is joining today's meeting via video teleconference. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I now give the floor to Ms. Sima Bauhaus.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and Ambassador Hoxha, for calling this meeting, and thank you to Ambassador Woodward for hosting this briefing during your presidency of the United Kingdom. At the outset, I want to express my solidarity with all Ukrainians, women and girls, men and boys, those who have left for safety and those who have stayed. My heart goes out to all families who have lost a loved one. This war must stop, and it must stop now. I returned last night to New York from Moldova, where the consequences of the senseless war in Ukraine were stark. Moldova has rightly been described as a small country with a big heart. Despite still reeling from COVID-19 pandemic, and with determination to achieve their national development priorities, they opened their borders and homes for those fleeing shelling and guns in Ukraine, the majority of whom are women, children, and the elderly. An estimated 95,000 Ukrainians are hosted in-country to date. Thousands and thousands more transited since the war started. At the different temporary shelters I visited in Moldova, exhausted, anxious, fearful, tearful mothers shared their worries about the future of their country, about the future of their daughters and sons and their families. A young girl from Odessa, Tatiana, told me her city is beautiful. She has a dream to become a doctor, and had her studies abruptly interrupted by the necessity to flee. In an act of determination and resilience, she and her colleagues are continuing their schooling online with the help of their teachers as well. Tatiana is determined to not let this war disrupt her dream. Vitaly, a young boy of maybe 7, told me about his sleepless nights, worried about his father, who was left behind to patrol the streets in their hometown. I witnessed buses full of women and children arrive at the Palanca border, tired, weary, and fearful. There, they were met with dignity, with compassion, and volunteers from civil society organizations, many of whom we support as UN Women. I heard from women's civil society organizations how they adapted their work overnight, going from grappling with 2 emergencies, COVID-19 and the energy crisis, to a third. They were able to work with the government to ensure that basic needs were met and services provided. They do this without specific humanitarian response training. UN Women, at their request, is supporting them in this adjustment. And UN Women is acting on our coordination mandate, working with the refugee response team and civil society partners to ensure that the gendered nature of this crisis is addressed with a gender-sensitive response. This includes services to provide with a focus on protection and to address the increased trauma and psychosocial support needs that I saw so starkly. Young women who left their homes at night, families who are separated, the constant fear of the future. This trauma risks destroying a generation. We must continue our support, but most importantly, we must continue all efforts to advance peace. I condemn in the strongest possible way the recent attack on Kramatorsk train station, which also killed civilians and UN civil society partners. The people killed in the train station are like the people met at the border, women and children and the elderly looking for safety. Humanitarians are not a target. Civilians are not a target. Excellencies, we are increasingly hearing of rape and sexual violence. These allegations must be independently investigated to ensure justice and accountability. The combination of mass displacement with the large presence of conscripts and mercenaries and the brutality displayed against Ukrainian civilians has raised all red flags. This esteemed body will hear more on this from the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict on Wednesday. Excellencies, a war of this magnitude impacts the world far beyond the borders of Ukraine. I also heard from the government in Moldova and the border police a need for increased support to monitor border crossings. The risk of human trafficking is increasing as the situation becomes more desperate. Young women and unaccompanied teenagers are at a particular risk. I call on all countries to increase their efforts in combating trafficking and commend all the host countries for their collaboration on that and on prevention. I equally call on all countries to support Moldova and others with increased resources for the police forces so that they can ensure support to victims of gender-based violence and trafficking. Gender-sensitive and survivor-centered response must be at the heart of all humanitarian action. Excellencies, through all these horrors, women continue to serve and lead their communities and support the internally displaced in Ukraine. Women make up 80% of all health and social care workers in Ukraine, and many of them chose not to evacuate. We have seen the women members of parliament continue to fulfill their duties in the Verkhovna Rada while bombs fell around Kiev. And we have also seen the Deputy Prime Minister engage in the humanitarian response. I have seen Ukrainian women, refugees in Moldova also working in the shelters and taking on roles to support each other. Women's organizations within Ukraine have not stopped working, adjusting their work to meet the immediate needs of the populations they serve. They do this at great risk to their own lives. They were there before the war, they remain there during, and they will be there to pick up the pieces after. I salute their courage and their steadfastness. They need our continued support. The Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund is already supporting several women's organizations on the front line in Ukraine and in Moldova to aid displaced women and girls, including shelter, medication, food, psychosocial support, including to women and girls living with disabilities or HIV and AIDS. The fund is also providing institutional support to these organizations to sustain them. With your help, we can do much more. Excellencies, without fail, every Ukrainian man, woman, and child I met had one dream: to be able to return homes. However, I heard yesterday many do not have homes to go back to. I call on this Council to continue to use all avenues for peace. From UN Women's own rapid gender analysis, we know that women are asking to be part of the solution. I heard from women in the shelters that they too are taking on leadership roles and supporting the refugee responses in the host countries, and many of them are in touch with other women, their friends, their family, who are supporting the IDPs within Ukraine. We know from experience that women's participation makes response and recovery more effective and more sustainable. And women's organizations are uniquely qualified to help not just women, but other marginalized and vulnerable groups. It is vital that they are consulted and engaged in all decisions related to the crisis response and related to peace. They need not be seen as victims only, but as agents and leaders of change, which they are. This Security Council has adopted 10 resolutions calling for women to be meaningfully involved in any decision or negotiation about peace and security. And we know that women's involvement is both a right and an opportunity for better outcomes. This is especially important in a war that has so starkly illustrated gender-based differences. Let us not lose sight of this. I have seen firsthand the impact of women's leadership can have. Yet women are largely absent from any current negotiation efforts. We ask the Security Council, all member states, and our development and humanitarian partners to ensure the meaningful participation of women and girls, including from marginalized groups, in all decision-making processes, peace, diplomacy, and humanitarian. Without this, we will not have peace, development, nor human security. To conclude, we strongly echo the Secretary General's repeated calls for peace, an immediate cessation of hostilities, and the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territories. Tatiana, the young girl from the shelter in Moldova, must be supported and enabled to pursue her medical degree and to be a part of the future of her country. The war must stop, and it must stop now. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Behus, for the briefing, and good morning. From me, I now give the floor to Mr. Emmanuel Fontaine.
Mr. President, Excellencies and colleagues, first I would like to express my appreciation to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and to Ambassador Ferit Hoxha for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Ambassador Woodward and the United Kingdom for hosting this briefing during your Security Council presidency. I actually just returned from a mission to Ukraine, and I must say in my 31 years as a humanitarian, I've rarely seen so much damage caused in so little time. Friday's attack on Kramatorsk train station was particularly horrifying. The station has been a critical route for thousands of families fleeing Donetsk Oblast, an area that has seen some of the war's worst violence and destruction. When the station was attacked, it was filled with families desperate to escape the mounting violence. I note the tragic irony that our teams were actually offloading life-saving humanitarian supplies only a kilometer away when so many lives were taken away by this needless act of violence. The attack on Kramatorsk station is unconscionable, and yet it is just one of many instances in this war where we have seen a blatant disregard for civilian lives and international humanitarian law. Inside Ukraine, children and families and communities are under attack. Of the 3.2 million children estimated to have remained in their homes, nearly half may be at risk of not having enough food. Attacks on water system infrastructure and power outages have left an estimated 1.4 million people without access to water in Ukraine. Another 4.6 million people have only limited access. The situation is even worse in cities like Mariupol and Kherson, where children and their families have now gone weeks without running water and sanitation services, a regular supply of food and medical care. They are sheltering in their homes and underground, waiting for the bombs and violence to stop. As of yesterday, the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office has verified 142 children killed and 229 children injured. We know these numbers are likely much higher, and many of them were caused by crossfire or the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I actually met one of those children in an intensive care unit in the hospital ward of Zaporizhia. Vlad, who is a 4-year-old, was shot twice in the stomach as he was escaping with his family from a contested area. Although still unconscious, Vlad is expected to live, unlike so many others. All the systems that help children survive are also under attack. Hostilities have damaged or destroyed hundreds of residential houses. Attacks on hospital, healthcare facilities, and medical equipment, and the killing and injuring of healthcare professionals are making it even harder for people to access emergency care, basic healthcare, and medicine. Hundreds of schools and educational facilities have been attacked or used for military purposes. Others are serving as shelters for civilians. Nationwide school closures are impacting the learning and the future of 5.7 million school-aged children and 1.5 million students in higher education. In the Donbass region, a whole generation of children have already seen their lives and education upended during the past 8 years of conflict. We applaud the effort of the authorities to ensure continuity of education. However, this can only be a temporary solution. Lessons from the pandemic show that the importance of children learning in a school with their peers and teachers. Excellencies, I met families in Zaporizhia who told me that they wanted to stay in their homes, but were forced to flee when the shelling and violence became too much. Thousands of others now are trying to leave before the fighting closes in around them. They face further dangers along the way, missiles, crossfire, and explosive remnants. In just 6 weeks, nearly two-thirds of all Ukrainian children have been displaced. They have been forced to leave behind everything, their homes, their school, and often their family members. I have heard stories of the desperate steps parents are taking to get their children to safety, and children being saddened that they are unable to get back to school. A social worker told me a story about parents who were forced to send their children with a truck driver just to get them away from the line of fire. Such unaccompanied children, of course, are at much higher risk of violence, abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. Women face a particular risk. We are extremely concerned by increasing reports of sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. Fortunately, there has been an outpouring of support from neighboring countries to welcome refugees. The solidarity expressed for Ukrainian refugees has been a very welcome development, one that surely should be replicated globally for all seeking protection and asylum, no matter where they come from. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are doing everything we can. Inside Ukraine, we continue to face extremely difficult operating conditions. We have seen some progress in recent weeks with our teams and supplies able to reach Sumy, Kharkiv, and Kramatorsk, among others. But this is not enough. Ongoing hostilities prevent us from reaching those most in need in many areas of the country. We saw that last week in Kramatorsk, when our teams were actually forced to stop offloading supplies and had to evacuate to safety following the nearby explosions. We are also helping local authorities to identify and register unaccompanied and separated children. We are providing families with much-needed humanitarian cash assistance and increasing awareness to minimize the risk of explosive ordnance. In Zaporizhia, I visited a reception center set up by local authorities, run mostly by women professionals, for displaced people to access health and psychosocial services, have a warm meal, and rest temporarily. These services are critical, but they are not the solution. Many of those who were able to flee early have been able to find sanctuary in other countries. It is not clear how those who are being displaced now will actually fare. They have been exposed to violence for longer and may have less resources at their disposal. Resources are already overstretched, and local residents live in a state of uncertainty as the sound of air raids and warnings from local officials ring regularly, reminding them that the front lines may soon reach them too. Excellencies, I'm particularly concerned about the widespread presence of explosive remnants of war, which expose children to the risk of death and horrendous injury. Eastern Ukraine was already one of the world's most mine-contaminated stretches of land, even prior to the recent escalation. This reality is rapidly extending to other parts of the country. We are also carefully monitoring the health, rights, and dignity of women and girls, as the risk of exploitation and abuse grows. And we continue to reiterate the need to ensure that children who have become separated from their families and who live in institutional care are protected, and that every effort be made to obtain caregiver consent and authorities' approval before these children are evacuated or relocated. In closing, I want to express how proud I am of our UN teams both inside Ukraine and in neighboring countries. The work they are doing is indispensable. I want to also salute the remarkable resilience of Ukrainian doctors, nurses, teachers, and social workers, especially women who have been at the forefront of the response. I was personally deeply impressed by the care they are providing children and families. I visited an underground maternity ward in Lviv that is staffed 24/7 by a team of tireless women assisting birth amidst air raid alerts. Local women's organizations are mobilizing grassroots networks to care for the most vulnerable, even on the darkest of circumstances. Their courage and commitment are a light in the dark. But most of all, I want to entreat all those with the power to end this war to actually use that power. The lives and future of millions of children hang in the balance. Excellencies, the math is simple. Every day the war continues, children will continue to suffer. As humanitarians, you can count on us to continue doing our work. But there's only so much we can do. It is time to end this war. Ukraine's children cannot afford to wait. Thank you.
Mr. Fontaine, thank you very much. I now give the floor to Ms. Katerina Charapaka, who joins us on the video link. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, today I have an honor and responsibility to speak and testify as a part of civil society organizations who stand for protection of independence and freedom of Ukraine for invasion by Russia. Organizations who consolidate their efforts at the national, regional, and community level with state and individuals, men and women, adults and children, who provide assistance, who help to save lives of civilians, often most vulnerable ones, who collect evidences and testimonies of survivors of war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine, to document them and to help to bring justice. I speak as a women's rights activist, as a specialist, as a mother, and since February 24, as a displaced person. With a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the whole population of the country is under the life threat. Women and children, as it always happened in the wartime, are the most vulnerable ones. In my presentation, I would like to focus on 4 aspects related to the impact of Russian aggression on women and children. Women and children are the biggest part of internally displaced people and refugees who left the country trying to save their lives. Often, they become invulnerable to the risk of gender-based violence, exploitation, and trafficking. Very often, during evacuation, with clearly indicated signs of being civilian, unarmed, carrying children, they are brutally killed by Russian troops. Hitting railway station in Kramatorsk, where civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, were waiting for evacuation train. The city where our colleagues, women's rights activists, put so many efforts to promote 1325 resolution and its spirit. Hitting maternity and child hospitals, kindergartens, bombing theater building in Mariupol, where women, children were sheltering, and with the clear signs, children that were visible from the sky. The city that always connected us with sisters and colleagues from Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. We received calls from women in Mariupol informing about forced deportation of civilians, including unaccompanied children, by Russian troops to Donetsk and further to Russia. So-called evacuation. Women were deported under the threat of rape and killing. Women in local administration, self-government bodies, they are also exposed to threat of kidnapping, torture, and killing. The head of Matizhin village, Kievska Oblast, Olga Sukhenko, was found dead together with her husband and son after being taken by Russian troops who occupied the village, severely tortured and killed, for staying with her community and performing her duty, organizing support, medicine, food to people. The deputy of Zaporozhska Oblast administration, Leila Ibrahimova, was kidnapped from her home. Director of the kindergarten, In Kyievska Oblast, Larisa Osipenko, killed by occupants because of her profession. You should not rise Nazis, they said. This tragic list of crime committed by thousands of ordinary Russian soldiers claiming that they didn't know where they are can be continued. Women are the important actors of peace and security sector in Ukraine, and their contribution during the war is really incredible. Together with activists, volunteers, journalists, they also become the target of the occupants. Ukrainian volunteer Yulia Payevska, Tyra, many years for saving lives of people in the occupied by Russian territories on the east of Ukraine, captured by Russian troops while organizing assistance for civilians in Mariupol. A video with captured Tyra was shown where she was forced to call to find the solution of the situation. At this moment, there is no information about her condition and what the situation is now with her. Women prisoners of war, exposed to torture, including sexual violence, undressed in front of the male groups, harassed, shamed. Journalists, female journalists kidnapped in Zaporozhska Oblast, 2 journalists, and another one killed near the Kyiv while performing their professional duties. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence and rape during the wartime. A number of facts and cases already revealed and reported, but unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg that we'll see. Many survivors remain in the situation of life threat. They are staying on the occupied territory. They are cut off from help, connection, from everything. We receive such calls to the national hotlines operated by La Strada Ukraine. For today, we have 9 cases of rape by Russian soldiers in the temporary occupied towns and villages. About 12 women and girls, children. Reports from Kyievska, Khersonska, and Chernigivska Oblast, reported by the survivors themselves and by the witnesses. Raped by a group of occupants multiple times, with life threat to survivors, their children, their family members, in front of the family members and other people. Real cases, real people, real facts. We see extreme traumatization, fear for life, not readiness to talk about what had happened. Those who manage to escape somehow to safer place are too traumatized to report. They need support, therapy, recovery first. We know that many of these cases will hardly or even never be disclosed, unfortunately, as many of those suffered are killed already by Russian invaders. We know and see, and we want you to hear our voices, that violence and rape is used now as a weapon of war by Russian invaders in Ukraine. At the same time, the war also shows the important role that women play in standing for Ukraine, in the processes of restoring the peace, strengthening and developing on the country and democracy process. We do not want you to look at us only as victims of Russian military aggression. Women in peace and security sector, volunteers, activists, journalists, human rights defenders are an integral part of the progress and development in Ukraine. We have knowledge, we have skills, we have expertise, we have strength, but we need to be saved and protected now. We call to all members of the Security Council, international institutions, the governments, to stop the war and demonstrate your solidarity in the concrete and practical actions, to find and to use the tools to stop Russian aggression and to ensure that your decisions are not blocked and not ignored. We call to ensure security of children, women, and men of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Katerina Charapaka for her briefing and thank her for joining us today. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And with that, I begin with Her Excellency, the Ambassador of the United States. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. President. We're honored by your presence here with us today and thankful to the United Kingdom for leading this debate. Thank you to our briefers from UN Women and UNICEF for your remarks and for the work your teams are doing on the ground. I, too, visited Romania and Moldova and saw your teams on the ground working with vulnerable people. And I'd like to give an especially strong thank you to Ms. Charapaka for being with us today and for sharing the voices of women and children in Ukraine. She's the first civil society briefer we've had brief us in an official council meeting. Thank you very much. When men like President Putin start wars, women and children get displaced. Women and children get hurt. Women and children get raped and abused, and women and children die. Since the start of Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, Russia has bombed orphanages and maternity hospitals. We've seen mass graves with dead children stacked on top of each other. On Friday, a train station being used for civilian evacuations, mostly women and children, was struck by a Russian missile. Washington Post reporters saw at least 20 dead, including children. Limbs and luggage were scattered everywhere. A maimed dog shivered next to one of the dead. According to the reporters, a large piece of missile on the scene had chilling words written on the side. In Russian, it said, "For the children." That is what Russia's war looks like. What is happening to women and children in Ukraine is horrific beyond comprehension. Mr. President, when I was in Moldova and Romania, I saw with my own eyes some of the human toll of Russia's brutal war. I met with a few of the 11.6 million people who are now displaced from their homes, representatives of the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The mass displacement includes over half of all of Ukraine's children. Half of Ukraine's children have left behind their homes, their schools, and often at least one of their parents. Meanwhile, 90% of refugees from Ukraine are women and children. And as our briefers make clear today, being a woman or a child adds an additional risk. Women in Ukraine are at increased risk for gender-based violence, including rape, sexual assault, and sexual exploitation. We know that anyone at risk before war is at a heightened risk of being targeted for physical and sexual violence during a war, and that includes women and children, religious and ethnic minorities, LGBTQI+ individuals, and people living with disabilities. The deputy mayor of Ivankiv told reporters that some girls are cutting their hair short in hopes of avoiding rape by Russian troops. Family separations leave girls in particular at increased risk for sexual exploitation and trafficking. And we've heard sobering reports of traffickers targeting women as they seek protection abroad. All of this is why the United States initiative, Safe from the Start, calls on all humanitarian actors to prioritize resources and programs to address gender-based violence from the onset. Given everything we know about gender-based violence in conflict and the accounts we're hearing, we cannot wait for a lengthy assessment. We should not hold up resources with the excuse of incomplete data. This is an active crisis that grows worse by the day. We need to start interventions immediately to prevent and respond to gender-based violence now. For our part, the United States funded humanitarian efforts in and around Ukraine lift up networks for survivors of gender-based violence in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, and we're supporting programs for child protection and advocacy too. We will continue to support our partners in these efforts. For example, we're highly supportive of UNICEF's mobile child protection teams, and we're working in conflict zones like Ukraine to deliver life-saving supplies and provide emergency social work services. These horrific acts also remind us that we must support efforts to prevent them from happening in the first place. This means ensuring that women's voices and rights are always respected and elevated. And it means ensuring that abuses against them and against children are held to account. There must be pathways to healing and access to justice for survivors. Finally, I want to remind us all that women are far from passive victims in this war. As we just heard from UN Women, women are playing critical leadership roles in Ukraine to address this impact of the war. Some women are valiantly defending their homes, their communities, their country, including many women who've been serving in the Ukrainian military since 2014. Others are protecting their families and their children, bringing them to safety. And still others are the ones supplying food and shelter, water and medicine to those in need. Women are the ones who will get Ukraine through this humanitarian catastrophe, and women must be consistently and meaningfully involved as active participants and leaders in securing long-term sustainable peace. When I met with women in Moldova and Romania, they all had different stories, but they all had the same dream: to return to a peaceful Ukraine, to return to a Ukraine where they have a say in their own and their children's future. Let us ensure women are a robust part of that peace process, and let us hope that day they dreamed of comes soon. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. President, Lord Ahmad, for chairing this meeting, a testimony of its importance and timeliness. Dear colleagues, the Russian aggression has not stopped. It continues to cause undue pain and suffering to 44 million people who did not ask for it. The relentless brutality and the destructive force of actions of the Russian army against civilians and vital civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is catastrophic. Unspeakable crimes have been committed, and each day the various pieces of the horror puzzle are falling in place. Grisly images of bodies charred or run over by tanks, mass graves, torture chambers, interceptions confirming that Ukrainian prisoners of war had been shot dead after being interrogated by Russian soldiers, playgrounds cribbled with bullet holes, kids' shoes scattered among the rubble of a school in ruins. Everyone is suffering in Ukraine, but the situation is particularly devastating for women and for children. This is why we called for this meeting, and what we heard from the briefers, whom I thank, is appalling. We're very pleased to listen to Ms. Cherepaka, and all accounts coincide. We just don't know yet all the horrible details. Hundreds of thousands of women have been forced to flee their homes. Others are fighting bravely to protect their country or work under bombardment and indiscriminate shelling as doctors, nurses, and other professionals providing essential service to their communities. We express our gratitude to all countries for their big heart in helping Ukrainians fleeing the war. Women and girls face heightened risks of gender-based violence, human trafficking, exploitation, and conflict-related sexual violence due to displacement. Their needs must be a priority in the humanitarian response. But the situation of children is even worse. As we heard from Mr. Fontaine, since the start of the war, 2/3 of the total child population of Ukraine have been forced out of their homes. Those still inside the country remain trapped in what has become a national nightmare. And if all this were not enough, some 120,000 Ukrainian children have reportedly been forcibly deported to Russia. Save the Children reports that since the start of the war, an average of 22 schools have come under attack every single day in Ukraine. Last October, this Council adopted Resolution 2601, which urges all parties to cease attacks and threats of attacks against schools. It was us. Destroying on purpose the educational infrastructure and making it dysfunctional for the years to come is simply criminal. Schools should be safe places, free from any kind of violence. And learning during conflict and crisis must be maintained, as it helps maintain a sense of normalcy and foster resilience. We know that mass displacement and refugee flows always create conditions that could lead to human trafficking and an acute child protection crisis. We commend UNICEF for the good work in providing recreational activities and psychological support in Ukraine. Blue Dot Centers are offering crucial services of counsel and protection. Mr. President, some 150 children will never see the end of war in Ukraine. They have been killed. Hundreds more, injured, will bear the marks of this war forever on their body. Children's lives are always shaped by the behavior of adults who themselves struggle in times of war. They have the duty to provide care and protection and ensure their upbringing. But how can a frightened mother holding her child avoid passing on her worst nightmare and fear that all of a sudden the kid may end up alone? How to explain war to children who in a matter of hours had to leave behind their family environment, friends, pets and toys, and who, traumatized, are unable to sleep or eat? In their normal life, children draw parents, houses and trees. Russian war has made Ukrainian kids draw bombs, tanks and weapons. Mr. President, civilian massacres carried out by Russian forces have rightfully stirred world outcry. Russia should have learned that a war can't be won through massacres. During the wars in the Balkans in the late 90s, the crimes against innocent civilians in Vukovar, Croatia, Srebrenica in Bosnia, and Racak in Kosovo did not help any of the perpetrators win the war. And this war will be no exception. We hear public indignation on one recurring question: why can't the UN do more to stop Russia? This question is right, and the anger is justified, because Russia, with its veto, has taken this council hostage, preventing it to deliver security in Ukraine. But thankfully, there is more of the UN that Russia cannot veto. We have met here 15 times in 10 weeks to expose Russia's despicable deeds and show its isolation. Also, in a matter of few weeks, Russia has, in 3 crucial consecutive votes, been put against the wall in the UNGA, which, in a remarkable and historic move, suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council. While deploring the Council's inability for reasons clear to all, we should be proud of the UN for standing firm against aggression, for looking Russia right in the eye and say, you are wrong and you will pay. Under international law, a military commander is responsible for war crimes committed by his troops. Lieutenant Colonel Azatbek Omurbekov, the Russian commander involved in the occupation of Bucha, will have to answer for the atrocities of rape, pillage, and murder of hundreds of Ukrainian civilians for such repugnant disregard of human life. If Kremlin thinks that they will benefit from the Tefal effect, they are wrong. Their crimes stick to their face. 5,600 investigations have been opened so far by Ukraine Prosecutor General. Accountability must be ensured. Dear colleagues, before anyone had the time to grasp its breath from the horrors discovered in Bucha and elsewhere around Kiev, a missile hit a train station where several thousand people were waiting to leave. A missile with a vicious signature for all children was sent to kill indiscriminately, including 5 children. And again, we were told, it's not Russia. Haven't we enough of this ridiculous pattern when Russia commits a crime and attributes it to someone else? Who was behind an attempt to overthrow the legitimate government in Montenegro? Who was behind the MH17 plane tragedy hit by a missile? Who carried out indiscriminate bombardments in Aleppo? Who poisoned the Skripals? Who almost killed Navalny? Who is putting the world upside down by a war of choice? All these crimes lead to Russia. We know now that the Russian army doesn't attack civilians except for the residential areas, the schools, the hospitals, the theaters, the kindergartens, and train stations. And we know also that Ukrainian men, women, girls, and children do not qualify as civilians for Russia. They are just a bargaining tool to achieve one man's cynical goal in assimilation and isolation, to force the hand of Ukraine into unacceptable concessions. Life expectancy in Ukraine is now at Kremlin's will. It may decide whether you stay in one of those shattered cities and you starve, It may decide to kill you with its missiles that hit everything indiscriminately. He may also offer the forced hospitality of a Russian camp. Mr. President, as we speak of children, let me end with this note. Reportedly, President Putin is a father. This is one of those words that do not need a definition. And if I were in the unlikely situation to talk to President Putin, the only question I would ask him would be, would you have accepted that your daughters be in the same situation as the 11-year-old Yuri, Ukrainian, who, forced to leave his home, terrified, tells reporters that, and I quote, "Every time there was a shelling, my heart stopped," end of quote. So stop making hearts stop. Stop shelling and bombardments. Order your soldiers still alive to go home, your home, Russia. As the Pink Floyd blasted last week, hey, hey, rise up. It is time for the Russians to come to their senses and stop and stand against this savagery. Thank you.
I thank Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France, Mr. Ambassador.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I should like to thank Ms. Bahous, Mr. Fontaine and Ms. Sherepaka for their briefings, which confirm the deep concern that we have been expressing since the beginning of the Russian aggression. We are still reeling from the atrocious attack upon Kramatorsk station on Friday. This may constitute a crime against humanity, as underscored by Minister Le Drian. Indiscriminate attacks must cease. France is deeply concerned by the proliferating allegations of sexual violence. This Council's resolutions on sexual violence in conflict are obligations